So now we're back for part 2 of the Mr. Smiley game, and we're going to start by creating our Mr. Skull object. This will be the last object we create, obj Mr. Skull, and then we'll change it to the Mr. Skull sprite. And to begin with anyway, we're going to have Mr. Skull just simply move toward Mr. Smiley in order to have a basic movement idea. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to add a step event, and what a step event is that it happens while the game is running. So every 30 steps is 1 second, so this is happening 30 times a second. So we're going to click on the step event, I'm going to scroll sideways, and we're going to add some actions here. And really the main action is that we're going to move toward Mr. Smiley. What that means is that we're going to use a movement block, the set speed block, and we're going to set a directional speed. And the directional speed will be 4, but we need a direction. So what we need to do is we actually need to set the point direction. I'm going to add that above my set speed. And we need to point in Mr. Smiley's direction. And objects in GameMaker are collections of variables. So each object has a bunch of variables called properties that are all linked together. A couple of those are the x and y coordinates of the object. So if we want to point in the direction of Mr. Smiley, we'll just change the x box to say obj Mr. Smiley dot x, and we'll change the y box to be obj Mr. Smiley dot y. And that way, when Mr. Skull is put into the room, he'll face towards, or he'll move towards Mr. Smiley. This is pretty much it. We're going to go to the room, and we're going to add a Mr. Skull object, and you're going to notice something when I start the game. So I'm going to start the game, and you're going to notice that when I move, Mr. Skull is going to move towards me, and then Mr. Skull doesn't, right now anyway, obey the walls, and that's because we haven't told him to do that. And anytime that happens in your game, you're going to be sure that it's because you have not done that. You haven't actually created a or added the code in order for him to handle that. We're going to handle that later after we create the maze. So now I'm actually going to create the maze. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to clear out my room. So I'm going to press and hold shift, and I'm going to click and drag. So I select all the instances in the room, and then hit the delete key so that I delete all the instances in the room. And then I'm going to change the room size. The room size is going to be 544 by 656, and that way it gives us the look about the right size as a Pac-Man board. And then I'm going to actually start placing walls in my room. So I'm going to click and select the wall object, but before I place, I'm actually going to use the Alt key to place, and that will allow me to place multiple instances at once. I'm also going to leave the top 2 squares on here open, so I'm actually going to start my maze here 2 squares down, and that will give me the ability to put the score and lives there when I do that. So right now I'm going to start with just adding an outside, oops, as best I can anyway. I'll undo that, maybe. There we go. Just taking care of being careful with this. So that way we have an outside to work with. And I'm going to make a maze that is going to be, select those and get rid of them, that will be horizontally reflective. It'll have reflective horizontal symmetry. And what that means is that when I look at it, or when I draw a line down the middle of it, it'll look the same on both sides. This is a feature of Pac-Man mazes, so that's where I'm getting it from. I'm also going to make my maze so that paths are all only wide enough to fit my characters. So like I might make like a big square here, or big rectangle here, and I'll fill that in. So if I do that, I want to mirror image that on the other side. So it's that 8 wide and 5 tall. So I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm leaving space for just enough space around the outside for the characters to get through. And then as I move towards the middle, if I want to make, maybe a little 2 by something here that gives me a space in between, I'm going to make it so that I can always go around things. Although in this case, I don't think I'm going to do that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this come out of the wall, so that our character, like Mr. Skull, doesn't make his way around the outside and get stuck. So there's one thing, and then I can just kind of start making more spaces for the characters to go. So if I make it far enough down here, maybe I'll make it so that you can only go this way. Except that's really horribly done. So I'm going to get rid of a couple of these, add one here, and then add another line here. But then I can mirror image that over this way. Okay. Maybe just little pieces here and there. Maybe a hole there. We'll make this nice and long here. Again, I'm just going to mirror image this sideways. So I'm going to do the same thing here. It's 5, and then it's a bunch. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Oop, too far, I think. So that's all I'm really doing. So anything that you really want to do, feel free to do it. There's no one way to do a maze. The maze is there for the characters to move through. So just remember that they're going to be moving through it. And so you got to make sure you have space for them to move through. So maybe I might cut that down actually, or I might maybe extend this here. Maybe do that, or maybe have a jog here. There we go. So again, this is just up to you totally. You're the creator. Create your maze. Okay, however you feel like it. Once you get your maze done, then you can pick the places where you want characters to be. So maybe you want your characters to start in certain spots, though that would be time to do that. All right, let me get rid of those. Okay, let's see. We'll put this here. So, that's right, I didn't add that to this side yet. There we go. Oops, going the wrong side. Undo that. Oops, don't redo that one though. There we go. And if I'm not talking a lot, that's because I'm kind of really focusing in on what I'm trying to do with my maze. Again, every maze is going to look different. So this even looks different than maybe the maze I'm doing with the working class. So that is probably likely. In fact, I think it is. But that makes it more interesting so that I can maybe do some different things and make it a little more interesting this time around. I think that was too far. Maybe do some different things than what I did last time. I can always try. Okay. So whatever your maze ends up looking like, whatever you choose to do, just keep in mind that you want to allow for characters to move through all the different spaces. Okay. Alright, I think that's good. Now I think I'm going to place Mr. Skull up here. I'm going to place Mr. Smiley down here. And then I'm going to put some apples in strategic places. So this one's another one that I could do Alt. Right? And again, place them in strategic places. You can place them wherever you want. I'm going to place mine symmetrically, since symmetry has kind of been the name of the game here for our game. Oops, I realized that I didn't do some other, oops, there we go. I realized I didn't do some other symmetrical things here, so I'm going to select these two, and yep, there we go. And yeah, we're just going to place apples strategically in the maze. Again, the idea is that not that we have a ton of apples, but that we have plenty of spaces where and reason to go in the different spaces in the maze. And that's certainly part of any maze chase game, is that we want to make sure that we're placing things so that the character actually has to try and navigate throughout the maze. So they can't just like stay in one spot, right? We should probably reward them for going through this hallway here. So now, here we go. We're going to run the game and just kind of see how it works. You're going to notice Mr. Skull is going to be able to go wherever the hell he wants to go, and that's because of how we did it. So just know that. But outside of that, it should work just the same as it did. We can collect all the apples. We can, our Mr. Smiley is going to go all over the place, but that's the main thing, right? Is that we have what looks like really the beginnings of a game. So we are now going to make Mr. Skull move differently, because now that we're in a maze, we need to actually make him move so that he follows and stays in the maze. And so when we figured out what the maze is going to look like, or what the code is going to look like, we are going to put it into three, or split it up into three different steps. First step is going to be to have Mr. Skull just start moving when the game starts, which is an important step. And then the second one is we're going to have Mr. Skull move differently when he hits a wall, and figure out how we're going to do that. And then finally, we're going to have Mr. Skull change his direction if he goes past an opening, and that way he can make a decision as to whether he wants to pursue Mr. Smiley or not, or if he wants to go a certain direction or not based on where Mr. Smiley is. All of this with the idea that we're going to have Mr. Smiley be the ultimate goal for Mr. Skull. So first thing we're going to do, though, is I need to go back to the Mr. Skull object, and we are going to actually just get rid of the step event, because we don't, or we're not going to get rid of it, I guess. We're going to just clear it out. So I'm going to select both of these and just hit delete, because we're going to change how Mr. Skull is moving. And I'm going to click OK to delete that. Now, we are going to do the first part of this, which is make Mr. Skull move toward or in one direction right away. Basically what we did is we have changed how he is moving, and we decided on some rules, and the rules were he's going to start moving to the right when the game starts, and then he's going to move toward Mr. Smiley at all times. If he hits a wall, he's going to move toward Mr. Smiley if he can. If not, don't worry about it. And then also as he passes through the maze, he's going to move towards Mr. Smiley if he can. So we're going to program that first part first. We're going to add a create event, and in the create event we're just going to start moving, set a speed, and start moving to the right. So we're going to change this to horizontal, change this to 4, and we can test that that works right away. So let's go up here and run. And once it runs, we'll see he starts moving to the right. And of course we haven't done anything else, so there's nothing else to see. So we can go ahead and close that, verified it. We're going to go ahead and save and get ready for the next part. So now we're ready to handle what happens when we collide with a wall and how that's going to work. And the basics are, when we hit a wall, we're going to check and see where Mr. Smiley is. If Mr. Smiley is somewhere where we can get to, meaning there's not a wall in our way, then we're going to move that direction, otherwise we'll turn around. So here we go. We're going to start with going back here though, and we're going to open up or add new event and add the collision event with not with Mr. Smiley. What am I doing? Delete that one. Oops, not even duplicate that one. Try this again. Delete, add event. Okay. Now we're going to add collision with the wall. So when we collide with a wall, we know that that's how we're going to behave. And the first thing we're going to do though is we're actually going to declare some temporary variables. 2 in fact. Temp h speed and temp v speed. And we call them h speed and v speed because they're actually going to store the horizontal and vertical speeds. You can see that's a built-in variable of Mr. Skull when we start, and that way we have those values to use if we need them later. Then we're going to set both speeds to 0. So I'm going to grab 2 set speed blocks, change one to horizontal, leave it at 0, change one to vertical, leave it at 0, and for both of them that will set them to 0, so then later on we just have to reset one of them. We don't have to reset both of them. So now we're going to start with our decision making, and the decision making is going to be made up of a bunch of if statements, and each if statement is going to check one thing or another. So our first if statement we're going to use is called an if variable, and that's because we're checking to see whether Mr. Skull is moving horizontally or is moving vertically. So, and the logic we're going to use is that if this value, temp h speed, which remember is storing the current speed of Mr. Skull, is not equal to 0, that means he must be moving horizontally. And if he's moving horizontally, then we want to check and see if we can, if he's hit a wall moving horizontally, that means we're going to have to go vertically in some way. So we're going to then, after that, check and see where Mr. Smiley is, and then check and see if there's a wall there. And this is kind of the whole progress of things. So we're checking first if we're moving horizontally. If we're moving horizontally, or if we assume that, then we're going to check where Mr. Smiley is. So we're going to use an if expression. And that if expression is obj Mr. Smiley dot y greater than obj Mr. Skull dot y. And to explain this real quick, objects are collections of variables. An object therefore has a bunch of variables called properties that describe it. To access those properties we use, it's called dot notation. So I give the name of the object, dot, and then whatever property I want. In this case I want the y coordinate. And the y coordinate is going to tell me where on the screen vertically Mr. Smiley is. And then I'm going to compare that with a greater than to Mr. Skull's y. And that will tell me if Mr. Smiley is below me. Because remember, y increases as you go down. So Mr. Smiley's y being greater than Mr. Skull's y would mean he's lower on the screen, and therefore he's below. So once we figured that out, he's below, we're going to now figure out if there's a wall in our way. So we're going to use the if object at place, like we did before with Mr. Smiley. So when I put that one in, I have to select what object I'm looking for. In this case, I'm looking for the wall. And then the place I want to check. And I can check in an absolute spot, or if I click both relative ones, I can check relative to my position. And I'm going to click relative, I'm going to change y to 4, because remember, increasing values of y go down, and therefore setting y to 4, but clicking relative will check 4 pixels below me. I'm going to leave everything else the same. I'm not going to use the not this time around. And now finally I'm at the place where I can now fully do an action. And in this case, if there's a wall in my way, I want to turn around. And so I'm going to set one of the speeds. I'm going to set the horizontal speed because I'm moving horizontally. Remember, I go back here to this. This tells me I'm moving horizontally. This tells me Mr. Smiley's below me. This tells me there's a wall below me. So now, if all those are true, I have to turn around. And what turn around means is that we're going to just change the sign of our current horizontal speed, which is, I'm going to use the temp H speed, that's why I stored it, and just put a negative in front. Now, the thing is that if there's not a wall, I want to move in that direction. To have code run when when a conditional is not true, we use an else. So I'm going to pull an else out. I put it underneath the if object at place because the if object at place is checking if there's a wall. So if there's not a wall, I want other code to run. Specifically, I want to set my horizontal, or my vertical speed, I should say, to 4 so I can move down. Okay, so recapping this whole thing, I'm checking if I'm moving horizontally by checking the temp H speed, checking that it's not equal to 0. Then I'm checking if Mr. Smiley's below me by checking an expression, obj Mr. Smiley's dot y, his y coordinate, greater than Mr. Skull dot obj Mr. Skull dot y, which is Mr. Skull's y coordinate, and that checks to see if Mr. Smiley's below. And then I checked below Mr. Skull to see if there's a wall there. And if there is a wall there, I turn around. If there's not a wall there, I'm going to go ahead and go that direction. And now that I've done that, I've accomplished kind of 1/4 of what I need to do. So now I'm going to add an else to this one. Because any time that Mr. Skull's not, or Mr. Smiley's not below me, he must be above me. If he's above me, I want to try and move up. So I'm going to repeat this whole thing here, the if object at place with the else, but instead move up. So what I can actually do is I can select all these and just copy. So I'm going to press and hold shift, press and hold control, I should say. So if I click the first one, press and hold control on the other 3. Click on each one of those. Then control C to copy. Click on the else, control V to paste, and then I just have to drag it over here to the right hand side of the else, so it's inside. It's attached to the else, and I make sure that this else is attached to this if object at place. And then I just need to make some minor changes. Change this to -4 so that I check above, and change this to -4 so I move up. And then I'm going to redo this whole thing from here on down with moving horizontally. However, it might be easier to do it by itself, but I need an else first. Once I have the else, then everything inside I'm checking on. So I put the else underneath the original check, because this, if I'm not moving horizontally, I have to be moving vertically. There's no other options. So now I can select all of these by pressing and holding Control. I could also select them over here, but it doesn't really matter as long as I select them all, and you can see them light up over there as well. So that way then I go copy again, Control C and Control V to paste underneath that, and then it also might help to just go ahead and I need to drag this one with its attached stuff to the right of the else. I need to take this else up here, and you can scroll and zoom out to do this. So I need to take this else here and attach it to this if. So that's why I'm zooming out. So this else needs to be attached. Oops. This else needs to be attached to this if. A little hard to see, but didn't quite get it. It's not working for me here. Is that right? Oh no, that already has an else. This else, that else is fine. It's this else. That's what it was. This else with that if. There we go. But now I need to make my changes. So I need to go back and I need to check if instead of Y, now that I'm moving vertically, I want to check X. So I'm just going to change the Y's to X's. I'm going to flip this here from 0 there to 4 there because I want to check to my right. And then we're going to flip this from vertical to horizontal, or from horizontal to vertical, I should say. And then flip this to horizontal so that I have, now I'm checking. So the else means if I'm not moving horizontally, which means I'm moving vertically, and I check to my right, that's what X is, and then I check if there's a wall there to my right, and if there's a wall, turn around vertically. If there's not a wall there, move. And then this else attached to this if means that Mr. Smiley is to my left, and so I switch these values to -4 for X, 0 for Y. I change this to vertical. I switch this to V speed. I switch this to horizontal. And I'm done. And now I check that it works. And we should see that when Mr. Skull hits a wall, things like he moves according to these rules. So oh, you know what? It's not working. Let's see. I'm going to go check my wall and see if there's anything I did in my wall. Oh, that's what I did. I didn't select solid in my wall. And that's an important thing to do. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to click solid, and making the wall solid will make it so that it doesn't move when a collision happens. When I do that, that should fix the whole problem. Amazing as it sounds, but, and there it goes, and he's moving. Now if Mr. Smiley moves, he should move along kind of with Mr. Smiley. So if I move, and I make it so that he moves. Now, there's other things that we have to do to make this work, but for now it looks like it works. So the last thing we need to do for Mr. Skull is to program him to move if he's passing an opening and he can move towards Mr. Smiley. So we're going to do that next. So I'm going to go back to the Mr. Skull object. We're going to add, actually we don't need that event, we can go back to our step event that is now empty, and we're going to use this event to determine, or to add all our code to. So close this down so we have some space, and here we go. We're going to first check and see if we're moving horizontally, just like we did with the walls, because we want to check and see if we're moving horizontally, then we need to check where Mr. Smiley is vertically, versus if we're moving vertically, then we need to check where he is horizontally. And just like last time, we're going to use a if variable. But this time, because we're not resetting both speeds, we are resetting both speeds, but we may not reset any speeds, we're not going to store the horizontal speed and the vertical speed in separate variables, so we're just going to use those directly. And you see it built-in variable there. So if h speed is not equal to 0, that means that we're moving horizontally. Then let's check above us, or let's check where Mr. Smiley is first, and then we can check above or below us. So we need an if expression, just like last time. Same expression, obj Mr. Smiley dot y greater than obj Mr. Skull dot y. And again, we're checking to see if Mr. Smiley's y is greater than Mr. Skull's y, and that means that Mr. Smiley is below us, because larger y's are lower on the screen than smaller ones. Finally, if he's below us, then we want to check and see, is there a wall in our way? But this time, because we only want to move if there's not a wall in the way, we're still going to use the if object at place, just like we did last time. And we're still going to choose the wall, and we're still going to click relative. We're still going to use 4 for y, but this time we're going to click the not. And the not flips everything. So normally the if object at place checks for that object at a certain place. If that object is there, it's going to return true. If we click not, instead we're checking to see, is there not a wall there? So if there is a wall there, it'll actually return false, which we want that to happen if we want to just keep moving, which means do nothing, because we're not going to have an else on this one. So if we are able to move, then we need to make our move. So we actually need 2 set speeds though, because we're resetting both the horizontal and vertical speeds. And so I'm going to reset the vertical speed to 4 and reset our horizontal speed to 0. That way we can move directly up. That way if we pass an opening, we can go up, at least if the opening's above us. If the opening's not above us, there's no opening above us, it doesn't matter. We're not going to do anything. So we don't have an else on this. We will have an else on this one though, because we do want to check if Mr. Smiley is above us. So I'm sorry, this was below. I keep saying above. This was below, now we're going to check above. Well, above is just this same thing, so it's these 3 things, but instead we're going to copy and paste those again. Instead of positive 4, we'll make that negative 4 and make that negative 4, and use the power of cut and paste. Okay. Then, if we're not moving horizontally, that's our else on that one, so we're going to add an else there. We're not moving horizontally, that means we're moving vertically. And if we're moving vertically, we need to check and see where Mr. Smiley is horizontally, which is .x, and we're going to check greater than obj Mr. Skull .x. And if Mr. Smiley's x is greater than Mr. Skull's x, that means he's to my right. He's to the right of Mr. Skull anyway. If that's true, then we want to see if we can move right like we did earlier. This time we'll go ahead and do it. It's easy enough. We're not doing as much as last time, so it's a little bit easier. So I'm going to add the if object at place. Again, we're going to click and select the wall. We're going to click both relatives. This time though, I'm going to make x 4 and leave y as 0, and then make sure I click the not, because I want to check for not a wall in that place and only move if there's not a wall. And then add my 2 set speeds. This time, just for my understanding, I'm going to do the horizontal speed first. So I'm going to move 4, or change horizontal speed to 4, change the vertical speed to 0, and that's it for that one. That covers moving right if there's an opening to my right. And then I want to add one more else for this expression here. So again, I drag the else underneath it, and then I can do what I did last time. Select, 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 copy, and paste, and then drag in. Change these. -4 for left, -4 for left. And that's it. Now that should cover all of our movement. I'm going to press play, and we're going to get going. and we'll see if this works. Now we should see that instead of just moving when he hits a wall, he should also have the option and try to move toward Mr. Smiley if he can. Right? So if there's space like that, he'll move towards Mr. Smiley. Now we still need to deal with what happens when Mr. Smiley touches Mr. Skull. We'll get to that next. So last thing we need to do is we need to get scoring and lives working, and then we're also going to add a sound to the apple to make it work. So let's get going with that. We're going to do all the scoring and lives in the Mr. Smiley object. So first thing we're going to do is add the create event, because we need to create some variables. Specifically, we need to create a global variable called game over. Now this is so that when we reach game over conditions, that we have something to keep track of whether the game is over or not. So we can use this as what we call a flag, which just means it's going to stay in one state false until I switch it to true. And these types of variables are called Boolean variables because they hold either a true or a false. And so this variable is really just telling me whether or not the game is over. As long as if the game is over, then we'll do something different. If the game's not over, it doesn't matter. We're just going to keep playing. Then we're going to assign a variable. We're going to create a variable or add a variable called score. It's actually a built-in variable that we're going to use. And we're going to set the score to 0 to begin with. I'm going to click the plus to add another variable. This one is called lives. You'll notice this is also a built-in variable. And this one we're going to set to 3 to begin with, because we're going to start with 3 lives, and we're going to start our score with 0. And the way it's going to work is we're going to, every time we eat an apple, we're going to get one. We'll get one point, and then if Mr. Skull catches us, we're going to get or lose a life. And then if we lose 3 lives, game over. If we eat all the apples, that's also a game over. So we're going to take care of those things here in Mr. Smiley. So we're going to add a collision event with the apple, and we're going to simply add an assigned variable, but this time when we select score, which we will, we're going to click the relative box, and we're just going to add a 1, which just means, remember, relative means we're adding. So we're going to add 1 to whatever score is currently. And that's pretty much it for this. The challenge is, of course, we need to be able to see the score on screen. In order to see the score, I have to draw it on screen. And the easiest way to draw it on screen is to use the draw event of the of Mr. Smiley. So I'm going to add that draw event now. And the thing about the draw event is, as soon as you add the draw event, first thing you need to do is make sure you go down here to drawing and add a draw self. You actually have to say draw my sprite. You don't have to do that unless you have the draw event. If you choose to have the draw event because you're drawing other things, then yes, you have to have the draw self. As for our score, we're going to put our score in the top left corner. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use a text alignment to align it to the left and top of where I'm drawing the text. And then I'm going to add a draw value to actually draw the value. And I can enter a caption. I'm going to enter the caption of score. And then the value that I'm going to draw is the variable score. And we're going to leave this as 0, 0 because that's the top left corner. And because we have left alignment, top alignment, it's going to draw it left aligned and top aligned, so that top left corner of the text will be at 0, 0. So now, when we run, we should see the score up in the upper left, and we should see score change when we eat an apple. And you can see it there up in the upper left. Again, we haven't done anything with Mr. Skull yet. We'll figure that out. But note that it's getting kind of hard to get through those. Note that if we eat the apples, you get points. Okay. So now we need to deal with lives. Lives, remember, are going to decrease every time that we contact Mr. Skull. Also, we're going to draw those too. So since I'm here in the draw event, I might as well draw them. The difference, of course, is that we're putting these in the upper right, and it's going to be easier for us to use text alignment to draw it and right align that text. And that's so that the upper right corner of the text will be in the upper right. And that way, when I draw the value, instead of having to guess, because I could use left align, I could use left align, but what left align is going to do, instead is would make me figure out where I need to put it so that it wouldn't go off the screen. But instead doing right aligned, I can set it up so that instead of using 0 for x, I can use the full width, which is 544, and then I can draw it there, and it'll right align for me. So if I, without having done any other coding, we can at least see that the lives will be up in the upper right corner, and there they are. So now we just need to set it up so that we lose lives, and then we'll go over the game over conditions. Now, when we lose lives, we always lose a life when we collide with Mr. Skull. Okay? And one of the things that we should do is we're not going to destroy the instance, we're going to reset everything. So when we collide, we're going to change the lives variable by, again, relative. This time it'll be -1 because we want it to go down by 1. So we'll add -1 to lives. Then we will reset both Mr. Skull and Mr. Smiley's, which is just jump to start. That's this block here. So I drag out a jump to start so that when I touch Mr. Skull, we jump back to start. I'm going to go to Mr. Skull and do that as well for when he touches Mr. Smiley. So add the event, collision, Mr. Smiley, and then voila, I'm going to add a jump to start. He just needs to jump back to start. There's nothing else that he's going to do. So now we see that when we play, we're going to be able to move, but when we come into contact with Mr. Skull, like there, we jump back to start and lives go down by 1. You see our lives are at 2 now. And then it happens again. Okay, now here's what's going to be the challenge. We're now down to 0 lives, and obviously nothing is happening, and I can go below 0 lives, and that's because I haven't programmed that part yet. So what we're now going to do is do the game over conditions. So we're going to include what to do when the game is over. So when the game is over, well, we know the game is over when we lose all of our lives. So that's one game over condition. So in order to simplify this, we are going to only do game over stuff in one spot. So we're going to check for game over conditions later, but we'll set up both the game over conditions right now. So when we take one off of lives, we want to check right after that, is that lives variable less than or equal to 0? So I'm going to use an if variable right underneath it. And we're going to check the lives variable, and is that lives variable less than or equal to 0? Because if it is, then we need to set the global variable, game underscore over, to true. And that's really all we need to do. If not, we use an else. If not, then we can jump back to start on this one. We're going to do something else on game over, but because there's 2 different ways to end the game, I'm going to put all that in a different event that we'll check constantly. to see if the game over flag has gone up. So this is the game over condition for losing all your lives. The other game over condition is if we collect all the apples, okay, which we could do here in obj apple. We could also simply do it in our step event, which is where we're going to do it. So I'm going to go to the step event and add the step event. Inside the step event, we're going to get how many apples there are. And what we call that is we need to get the instance count. So that's this block here. So we grab the instance count. We select apple. And when we get the instance count, we want to store it in a variable. And we'll call it apples. So the instance count is stored in apples. Once we have the instance count, then we can check how many apples we have. And in this case, because we're talking about instances, we can use equal, because we know there's not going to be negative instances. That's just impossible. So we're checking to see is the number of apples equal to 0, and if so, then we're going to do the game over condition, or I guess not do the game over conditions. We're going to set the global variable game over to true again. Okay, and we're not going to do anything otherwise because we don't care otherwise. We're not doing anything otherwise. Now we also need to check and see if the game over is true, and this is the space where we're going to do the game over conditions. Now you notice when I type game over, it gives me global.gameover, and I'm actually going to hit enter to have global.gameover, because when you use a global variable, it goes in this object, quote unquote, called global. And so if I just used game over, it would be looking for a game over variable inside of the Mr. Smiley object, which one does not exist. It's a global variable. And then this one we can do equal to, because we're only doing true and false. And if it's equal to true, then we're going to do game over stuff. So here's the game over stuff. We're just going to make Mr. Smiley and Mr. Skull disappear right now. So here we go. So we need to find, let's see. Oh, we're going to set an instance variable. That's what we're going to do. So we're going to set this instance variable. We need 2 of these though. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to set visible to false for me. And then we're going to do the same thing, but I'm going to click on the top here. Click up here to apply this to Mr. Skull. Okay, and you'll notice it turns purple, and it might be hard to see, and actually it's not there right now. But we know that we're going to set Mr. Skull's visible also to false. Okay, now in order to check my game over conditions, I need to let it go to game over. Now this will be able to check, we already know that lives works, so really I'm just going to check that the game over condition works. That getting to lives equals 0 will actually gets to game over, and there you go, they both disappeared. Now, though, the other way I need to check is I need to check that the game over works for catching all the apples. So I should probably try and catch all the apples now, which might be a little more difficult. If you need to, you can always insert code to make it easier for you to win. You know, give yourself unlimited lives, or turn off the live changing so that you can test it. You can also simply have a cheat key and allow Mr. Skull to or allow Mr. Smiley to use the cheat key. I'm not going to show those right now, but know that you should check that out. I'm going to trust that it works, and we're going to go from there. The last thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to add a sound for the eating the apple. So I'm going to create a sound just like I know how to. I'm going to go find my assets, which should be for me in my Maze Chase Game Assets. There's one right there. We're going to open it, and this is the sound. It's called chomp. And so I'm going to call it SND chomp, because that's what it's doing. And then the only thing I need to do for that is I need to go to the Mr. Smiley object, go to the Apple object, and then add in a sound. I'm just going to play a sound, this one here. And I'm going to select SND chomp, and then we play. And then now as we play, we can see that we can hear the chomp sound coming through. So that's a little enhancement to our game that makes it a little bit better. So at this point, our game is pretty much done. There's only maybe one more thing that we need to do, and that'll be to, well, here I'm almost to the point of being able to test. Oop, and there it went. And I might be able to test game over for apples here. Oh, almost. There we go. And the game over works for apples as well. The only other thing that we might want to do is actually show on the screen that the game is over. And because we've gotten rid of all the apples, we wouldn't have anything on there, and we made Mr. Smiley and Mr. Skull disappear. We want to do that in the OBJ wall. And the way we do that is we're going to add the draw event, of course. And because we added the draw event, we want to remember to draw ourselves. Don't forget to do that. But then also we can check and see if the game over variable, remember, if you type game over, it should show the global game over, so I'm going to hit enter to get that. If the global game over is true, then we should also draw in the center of the screen the words just game over. So we're still going to draw just like we did last time, which is use the draw value, but this time we're going to leave the value blank and we're just going to type something in the caption here. So we're going to type game over. And to put it in the center, we just need to give the x and y that is the center. That would be 272 for x, and then with y, 656 divided by 2 is 328. Okay, and then the only other thing we want to do to make sure it stays in the center is to change the text alignment to center and middle. And now we know that all the other stuff works, so the only thing left is to see that the words game over appear in the middle of the screen when game over is reached. So that one I don't need to test a specific game over. I'm just going to seek out Mr. Skull real quick. And there we go, and we see game over written right in the middle. So that is pretty much it. We're all there. We can save it, make sure we keep it, and then we're ready to move on.